in Photoshop. It's a lot different from Illustrator. Illustrator has always been described to me as a really stuck-up software tool. In other words, it only wants to work one way. But in Photoshop, you can do the same thing, maybe 5, 6, 7 different ways, or you can invent your own way of doing something sometimes. So Illustrator's not that way. It's not forgiving. So you'll enjoy working in Photoshop, I think, but it has its traps. There's pitfalls. It's easy to kind of make mistakes that come back to bite you later on. So hopefully we can help you avoid that. And don't be shy, experts. If you want to chime in and share some experience too, you're welcome to as well.
After we're done, not during.
Yeah, after. Yeah.
Well, what's the main difference between Photoshop and Illustrator? Right. Which one's which?
Illustrator is Illustrator while.
All right. Does everybody hear that? Yeah. Vectors versus pixels. Yeah.
Is that Illustrator is a drawing tool, more or less. It's kind of that's the spirit of Illustrator. Whereas Photoshop is a pixel manipulation tool. So
yeah.
I had a real expert in both of them explain that to me. That when you kind of distill the spirit of both of those programs down, that's kind of what it means to draw a program versus a pixel manipulation program. So you're manipulating pixels here.
So what you're looking at is the two kind of demonstrations of the finished kind of output that's going to go into an Illustrator template and then plot it into something that size. And it basically consists of a background, a couple different layers of foreground, and a layer of Entourage. So we've got Entourage, we've got some foreground elements right there. We've got the space frame element. We've got the background element. And we've got our kind of graphical overtone element that's in the far back. So the thing that you'll get will not have the space frame, obviously, because you have your own space frame. And you have to determine, or not determine, but you have to produce that image in both cases. So the same thing here, although this one doesn't have preset Entourage on it. It will be missing that. And this one has background. And it also has a foreground element that's a copy. So there's a copy of the tree. This is actually an isolated element. So it looks like that. It's hanging out there. And then there's a background behind it, and in between the frame happens. So there's room for that too. How do we arrive at that is that you've got to create renders from your original Rhino model of the space frame that you've got. So we're basically using the same template file that was distributed with the last video. And what we're doing is taking that model in place that's used for the axonometrics, not the one that was warped for the axonometrics, but the original one, and accessing it to place the camera in the right spot and get the renders that you need. So these images are already established at a set size of 12 by 24. So there's a setting that's already set up in our Rhino file for that when we look into our options under tools. Part of the file itself already has these options under the Rhino Render. This custom size is already matching the same DPI and size, and all the environmental settings are already set up into the file. It's basically the way a render would be set up if you haven't played with it too much. Is you need light, you need an environment, and you need a camera angle. Those are the things that tend to be the three things. The fourth is materials as well. The environment is already in there. It's a Rhino Sky environment. Without it, you're only going to have a sun that would act like a spotlight. So things would either be totally black or totally white in light, and it would be very graphic. But if you take a look back at what we're looking at with the space frame, we don't want just black or white. We want a gradient value to show that we've got something with some dimension to it, and it wants to cast shadows onto itself at different amounts. So there's levels to our shadows. It's not just all black or white, but depending on the depth and the orientation of the space frame, you're going to see a kind of range that happens in there, right? So that's already set up. You don't have to worry about that. None of these settings need to change. The file also has a sun file that's already in there as well, and that's at the summer solstice at 2 p.m. And that's going to be used for both renders. So that's already part of the file. The thing that you need to add is the actual geometry itself. So I've got my site model. That site model, if you were to look at the materials for that layer, is already set to a white matte. That material is already set up for the site, and it's set by layer. So that's already ready to go. And I've also got a layer called pipes for render, and that's already set to have white matte. So whatever geometry goes on that is already going to have that material set to it. You don't have to worry about it. All you basically have to do is make sure that your pipes are on that layer. I'm just going to import some geometry because this is the template file, so it doesn't have a space frame in it. You're providing that. So I'm just going to import my space frame that I did earlier into there. Let's see. So these are all curves like we left off with. What I want to do is I want to give them dimensions by piping it and using the pipe command. So on my pipes for render layer, I'm going to go solid pipe. And my radius is going to be 0.04. That's the radius that you want to use for these renders. Keep in mind it's a really small number because this model is not at full scale. It's at 3/16. That's a few inches when it all comes down to it. And it's a lot of geometry, but because it's so simple, it'll pipe relatively quick. Pipes are extrusions. They don't have as much information as, say, like a poly surface does. They basically have a radius, and they have an end condition on them that it's extruded along that. So they're not too kind of heavy lifting. You can see my model's not slowed down or anything. So when we look back at the Rhino file, we've got these named views already set up as part of the file. They're called Montage 1 and Montage 2. So all you have to do is set your current viewpoint by bringing up this panel, and if it's not there, you can go to this little gear and say, show me my named views right there, and then select the one that I'm ready for. This view is, Montage 1 is talking about this one right here. Does anybody kind of have an idea of where that is taken from? Just, I know it's kind of out of context, but if this is the velodrome right here, right? Someone said something. Yeah, it's kind of by the dog, like you said, dog park, right? It's a little bit south of the dog park where kind of the pull-up bars are, looking across the little canyon into the back of the velodrome as well. And this one should look familiar too, right? That is around the baseball field near kind of the benches, right? Someone's standing on the benches near the baseball field. So this is towards the northern kind of entrance to the site. So pretty familiar spots. And you can see those just as a kind of tip. If you ever want to see this camera in Rhino, if you hit F6, your active view will show you in other viewports where your camera is. So if I hit F6 and it's showing me where my montage for number 1 is, and it's over there by the pull-up bars, kind of going down into the canyon a little bit. And that's a toggle, so if I hit F6 again, it turns it off. So this view's already set up. The main thing you have to worry about is just not moving the camera at this point. You just want to basically, my materials are on the right layer. I want to hit the render button. Don't worry what it looks like in the viewport, because when we went into our settings here, it overrides. This overrides what's going on in the viewport, and it's going to output the long 12 by 24 render that we want. So yeah, and you don't have to worry about the curves too much. You do want to make sure that 2 things are on. Your topo's on and your pipes are on, because if you don't have the topo, you're not going to know what's blocking the land and how it's sitting on the site. So you want to include that. And for this view, you want to be able to get the cast shadows onto the ground that this sun produces. So then at that point, you're just going to hit render. So these are big renders, and they have a couple hundred members laying on top of each other, casting shadows on each other, so it takes a longer time to calculate than something like a bunch of boxes or something like that. They're going to take, it all depends, they're going to take anywhere. My experience was this one, the render for the one that's on the pull-up bars, took about 3 hours. The other one took about 8 hours because that one has the entire system with a lot of depth to it. It's pretty standard for a render of that geometry. So what you need to do is budget your time accordingly. That's all there is to it. Right? So an 8 an hour one's one where you just set up overnight, let it go. Yeah.
Rhino not have a render tower?
Built into it? No. That's just a computer setting where you just set it on your settings not to fall asleep. Just put your computer on high performance. But none of these will fall asleep. In a lab and on your laptop, you just tell it to not fall asleep. Just put it on high performance in the power options. It'll just run. So we're not going to sit here the whole time and obviously for 3 hours to let that one sit. And it might vary. Yours might be shorter. It might be longer. I don't know. It depends on the geometry. So
how did your first run?
3
hours?
3 and 8 for the two that are right here.
For those two?
Yeah.
3 hours each?
3 hours and 8 hours. Yep.
Top one was 3 hours?
8.
I'm guessing. Top one was 8 hours? Bottom one was 3? So that's when you go get dinner, right?
Yeah. Or you could draw them by hand. Maybe you can do it in under 3 hours. You guys done? When it's all done and rendered, what you need to do is save it as a PNG. If you save it as a PNG, it'll have a transparent background, and you'll be able to pull the image into it. If you save it as any other image, it'll have a colored black background, and you would have to go in and manually remove the background, which you don't want to do. It's a waste of time, right? So I do my renders. I save them as a PNG. I've got them both here as a PNG, so I've saved them there. I do it for this view. I do it for that view, and then I'm done. Once I have those, I'm going to bring those into Photoshop. So these came into Photoshop like that, but let's say that I don't have them into Photoshop yet. Because you're going to have this condition. So now I'm going to place them in there. If I can find it. They should come in at the right size already. And this one is, you can kind of see. So this is bigger than the surroundings, and that looks right. So I got my other one here. Oh, that's the wrong one.
I think we worked on that.
Oh, so it got deleted. It got saved over.
So maybe the other one's better.
Yeah, but that one doesn't have the kind of the tools that we need to use on it. It's fine. I'll find my version of it.
Well, if you want to work with your file, the original.
No. This one came off a little askew, but it's the right size, so I'm just going to move it right there. So I've got this in what looks to be, accept that, in the right spot, right? So I need to remove the kind of extraneous elements of it. And in order to do that, I'm just going to turn off some of this other information that I've got just to kind of clarify what's going on here. And the kind of tool of choice that Alex was using was your background eraser tool. So it's underneath where the eraser tool is here. Let's switch to that. And the actual option that you use is this one, right?
Yeah.
The sampling once, which looks at a kind of singular element. So I'm going to zoom in.
It'll always default to 50% tolerance, but I found that just nudging it down maybe to 48% works a little bit better. And it's surprising how much it changes within just 1 or 2%, sometimes 3%.
This came in as length, so I'm going to rasterize it to flatten it out so it's a bunch of pixels now, and I can look at it like any other element in Photoshop. And when I do this tool, I use the option, right, to sample?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sampling, and then once I do that, yeah, I'm using it the wrong way though, right? Oh, I see, it's a one-off, okay.
Yeah, it's a one-off. So you just click once and hold down.
So I click once and hold down, and as I'm holding down, it's grabbing that value and removing it from it. And this is one of the reasons why we have just a pure white background, so that we can keep the shadows, we can keep the elements happening here, and we can kind of increase the brush size here and use it multiple times. So I'm keeping my finger on there. And once you get into this kind of level here, you can start to zoom in. You can see it's very specific to like its own value. So if you do something with a little transparency, it's going to seek out those values as well. When you do like these major kind of moves where you've got this big swatch here, you can also use the lasso tool. And this version of it is the polygonal lasso tool, which makes you just draw shapes. And you can, instead of brushing everything out, you can just take out a big chunk real quick. So in this one, you're going to have elements that are coming from two things that you want to get rid of. You want to get rid of the white area of it, right? And you also want to get rid of this kind of gray shadow getting cast on the topo by the topo, because you've already kind of got that information going on in the background and it's kind of blocking it. So in terms of what I'm getting rid of, I'm looking to get rid of this kind of information, and I'm also looking to get rid of this kind of information, right? I'm looking to keep these shadows that are in there. That workflow will get you pretty far with this one. You will have some highlights that you want to kind of keep out, or keep a lookout for when it comes to the once your space frame gets in. You're going to have highlights that are hanging out there, and you don't want to use that tool here, because what will happen is you'll start to see that you'll start to delete part of your pipes. So stay away with the pipes with it. One thing you can do is, I think you can use this like tool with a marquee, right? Alex, right? So you can give yourself like a marquee to use, which would be any kind of selection tool. And if you do it, if you've got any kind of selection happening right then, it's just like a guard that keeps you from using this tool. So I go back to my tool, and now I'm not worried about going beyond the boundaries of this marquee, so I'm not going to hit my stuff out there. And I can use a bigger brush that way and start to clean this stuff up instead of kind of going in there. So that works really well for the velodrome. As you can see, I'm kind of keeping my shadows there. Works well for this value because it's a little bit darker than the shadows. But just be careful. Don't be heavy-handed with it. You've only got to do 2 of these, so it's not going to take a ton of time. And then when it comes to, so I'm hitting Control D and I'm releasing that marquee. And when I get in here, I'm just going to take advantage of the fact that these are all triangulated and just draw shapes and delete. It happens pretty quick when we kind of look at it. Looking at the other one, that's very much the same idea with that one, because that one's going to be looking up at the topography, and you're only going to be using ridges for it. which is this one here, getting dropped in. I'm just going to adjust him. We don't have to worry about the shadows cast on here because these are all these flat-faced polygons. We're just going to get rid of them to a good amount, and we're going to work around this one. So if I go into select, let's use this tool. That's not the selection I want. This particular montage can be handled almost entirely just by grabbing these gaps on the inside, like that. Make sure you take this layer and rasterize it so it'll treat it as pixels, and then you can start to pull it out. But kind of keep in mind on this one that this foreground element is going to block it up here, and that you need to clear this out to show the hills behind it so that we can see what's going on behind there as well. So this stuff will come down and we'll be able to see what's happened. So you can see that's actually what happened here. I did it. In order of how long I took to kind of clear out the bottom of this, it was while we were talking about the handout. I selected it all and cleared it out. So that was what we do, 10 minutes on the handout or something like that. It doesn't take that long. It's a pretty precise tool. And then you can clear out the front. You can kind of ignore this foreground element right here, and then you can clear out the front just by going in pretty broad in the beginning and then coming in and fine tuning it. So whenever you're doing any of these tools, you can continue to zoom in and out.
If you guys pay attention to his technique, when he's doing the outer perimeter, he goes beyond the boundary of the canvas. And
that'll move your canvas over. It's not like Rhino where I can hold down the shift bar and pan. It doesn't respect that. I'm in the middle of the tool. It gets a little bit tighter. And you can delete that out and then basically going into that one as necessary. Here I would crop out the parts where in my case it's sticking into the landscape and these kinds of things to get this kind of final output. The other thing you want to do is if you want to kind of track your any of these tools when you use selection, keep in mind what's going on up here. So this is a normal selection where you'd select once, you select a new one. This is where you add to the existing selection. This is where you're taking away. So if you do any kind of mistakes, let's say I do this and I'm working and I kind of want to just keep track of my selection, but I make a mistake and I meant to get inside the pipe and I go down here, right? And I don't notice it until later on. This is the time where I would change my selection tool to be subtractive and then use that tool to subtract from the selection. Instead of starting from scratch, I'm adding and taking away from the subtraction like that. I don't want to start over every time. And then I can switch back to my additive kind of subtraction kind of stuff. So that gets us in there. And we kind of talked about Entourage, right? And we kind of talked about how we've got a fantastic example of Entourage. And we see that as a style guide because he's very stylish. This is the kind of look we're looking for, I would say, right? In terms of being black and white, being high resolution, not distracting by being low resolution, thematically kind of trying to find something tasteful yet kind of interesting and active and specific to the site. And we have that example to pin up next week for your montage. That's the chance to get feedback on what ones to use and what not to use. I would wait to get the thumbs up on that one. And the same thing here. This one might have a little bit more trick to it. So you can see that foreground tree now blocks it and makes a little bit more sense, right? You've got a foreground element. These foreground layer is the things that are on the pull-up bar hill. So if you want to have something up there, just be aware that it would be very large, and you want to kind of cater to that kind of knowledge. And the same thing with this being, if we kind of zoom in, this is the wall that's right there. So it's pretty small. It's not huge. I think you have to kind of also keep in mind the size of these drawings. The Entourage will show up, but they'll be pretty small. So in terms of level of detail and the kind of contrast, you want some kind of high contrast type of stuff. I've also got shadows on here that are not showing up tremendously well. One thing we can kind of do with that is to burn them in a little bit more, and that darkens the shadows. So let's see. Burning is an old tool that's used from literally photos, and it's basically what it sounds like. It's adding kind of information into it, and it's overexposing more. It used to be overexposing the paper more to the UV rays when you were making a print, and it basically just makes things darker. It's kind of like a multiply brush. So what you can kind of do is you can change your rid tone, change it to shadows. So now I'm using the shadows options with burning, and what I'm doing is I'm taking this information, I'm working on the space frame layer, and I'm taking that info and I'm burning the shadows in to be a little bit more significant. You can start to see they're starting to show up down there. Starting with this light gray, and now I'm getting to something that's a little bit more significant that's going to show up down there. And keep in mind that although it only may be a few pixels, you've got a pretty big print that's going to happen, and the space frames themselves are only a few pixels wide, but they still show up in the final print. And if it gets too dark, you can use the opposite tool, which is the dodge tool. And you can change the brush on this to be a little bit smaller, and you can start to dodge stuff out and make it lighter as well. Lots of cleaning up to do, and kind of maintenance happens on that. I think that's...
Yep. I wanted to talk about the Entourage real quick.
Yep.
So one of the things that was mentioned in the guide portion of the handout was regarding specifically how you think in terms of Entourage being placed into your photo montage. So as you can see here, our Entourage was placed in the foreground. And one of the things that you want to pay attention to is the horizon, as mentioned before. So a real easy way of kind of identifying where your horizon or your multiple horizons are is just by, if you can turn on rules.
Mm-hmm.
On the rules. You'll want to go into view and turn on your rulers. And what you can do is you can grab one of the grid bars.
Yeah, you have them under guides, or would you have them under?
Oh, you just actually click into the bar.
Oh, make a new one?
Top. Yeah. Just
I thought you had one saved.
So you
to it.
click and drag it down roughly to where eyesight would be, which would be at horizon. So in this case, it would be just below the Coronado Bay Bridge. And if you notice, our Entourage is roughly right there. So what you want to do is size your Entourage. In other words, place it and then size it to eye level at the horizon that you've chosen. So, or that you've identified rather.
What's in the new layer for the road? For the guide, because it's going to go then.
You don't have to. No, you can actually do the work of creating another layer that has just guides on it if you want to, or if they're just going to be so temporary that you just use them for that immediate tool, then or that immediate purpose, then you can just delete them, or you can turn guides off if you want to.
Just to change it, you're going to see this kind of marquee happen for your mouse. It'll change to this. It's kind of specific to moving guides in Photoshop. You don't see it for other stuff. Other stuff, you would just see the normal black arrow, this little bar here.
So if our Entourage were to be placed way back here beyond in the background, then you'd have a different horizon. So you'd have to identify where that location is. So if you're down below in the infield of the velodrome, the horizon's different down there as well. So you have to identify those locations in order to kind of represent those correctly. And as you can see, there's a tool called Transform that allows you to rescale these and move them around and distort them as well. But in order to keep them so that they look proportionally correct, you need to hold down the Shift key as you scale them. So hopefully everybody remembers to do that. Otherwise you get this kind of disfigured Entourage, and it doesn't look right. So make sure that you're mindful of holding down shift as you're doing that. So place down there. So there's obviously going to be a new horizon for anything that's placed down there. So you would want to drag in a new guide bar to that height. And then anything along that line would actually, eye level would be matched up with that guide line. It's an important thing to remember. Pardon?
How'd you know where to place that horizon line? That secondary one?
The next one?
No, that one right there. Yeah. But
sometimes it's guessing. So you want it to look right. So you might have to play around with it to make it look right, because the horizon may not be obvious. So you may have to actually kind of set up your own working horizon, so to speak. So I would play around with it first to make sure that you get it right. And it's a little bit tricky too, because it's a curvilinear section of walkway. So the horizon changes as you're walking through that. But if it's pretty horizontal, then it should be pretty much the same. The only difference is when you have different height people. So if you have children, they're all going to be at the same height unless they're sitting. But if everyone's standing up and they're roughly close to 5.5 to 6 feet tall, their eye level is going to be pretty close to the same horizon. Yeah. Yeah. So everyone hear that? We're providing.
why is it smaller than
It's not.
He's talking about the context.
Oh, the context. Okay. So the canvas is 24 by 12.
Yeah. Why is this picture smaller?
Yeah.
Because it is. It's my favorite answer. Hope it satisfies.
So remember, go back to the spirit of what we're doing. It's atmospherics, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to portray kind of a certain experience, and it's an idea. And sometimes you have expressions that maybe push the limits. And they help us understand too that this isn't real.
Yeah.
This is imaginative. It's what could be.
We're not trying to
right?
replicate reality. We're not trying to replace it.
Yeah, representation.
Good on that? Yeah, okay. So the next thing that we want to talk about was also once we have this in here, we talked about our final model and what we need to kind of produce it. So you've got an apparatus that helped us produce these programmatic structures, right? And then what you kind of did along the way was import them into here, create your digital model. Now you've eventually adjusted the bottom to sit on the ground, right? You've made probably some other kind of minor adjustments, and you're saying, well, how do I arrive at the final model of this thing? I think it's a good idea to take your existing apparatus and use it as a guide and say, well, where's my origin point? What changed? What didn't change? Because if it didn't change in terms of going from my analog to my digital, I've already got markers on these strings directly where I need to start building this model, right? And you kind of already have that, especially towards the top of your model, where there's the least amount of change. So when we talk about the final model, we're talking about that entire kind of cluster / column system. We'd also like to see some included context around it. So when you look at the diagram that we provided on the handout last meeting, you can see it starts to branch out into the existing context. I think we also talked about the possibility of using or reusing Model 1 if you want to add to that, or kind of take it apart and reuse those parts to populate some of the things. But what we want to know is a kind of idea of where does this thing touch down, how does it touch down, and what does it connect to in terms of the larger picture? Give us an idea of how this whole system works. To kind of help out in that, I think it's good to know where these coordinates are in your new space. So I kind of came up with a tool to kind of help with that. And what it does is it tells you to assign an origin point, and it gives you all the relative coordinates based on where that origin point is. So you can either replicate wherever you decide your origin point was in your apparatus. You can start at one node that you have already locked down on your model, and you can have an output of all the coordinates and where they need to go in the same Cartesian space. So, for example, I'm just going to isolate one of these clusters here. Let's see. Let's do this one, and I'll have this stuff here. So let's say that this was your model that you've got. And what you're trying to do is find out, now that I've moved this and I've adjusted it to the site, where are my points that I changed and how do I make this thing? It's just a simple kind of grasshopper definition that has two inputs. It has an origin point, and it has the curves of what you're trying to build for a model. And this is actually supposed to be, this is an older version of it, so let me find a. Maybe not. Maybe I did not save it. This will work though. I just need 3D tag. So one thing I'm going to give myself is I'm going to create a new layer and call this my reference point or my origin point. And make that my active layer and just make a point. So maybe I'll start right now. I've got my end snaps on. I'll start like right here. So I've got a point that's right there. And let's say that this is approximating my origin point in my apparatus. This is my origin point here. Set one point is right here. And I'm going to set my space frame curves. So that's whatever curves are in my space frame. So I'm going to set multiple curves here. And those are already set, but I'll reference them again. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell me, for instance, on this one, what my coordinates are based on where my origin point is. So that'll give my origin points. And you can see as I'm changing my origin, I now have a list of coordinates. So the output on that is going to be a tag. I have a newer version of this that also has a 3D tag, but it also has the outputs here as well. So you can see that that informational update on this panel based on where my origin point is. And if I had made any changes, it's going to output that. So it depends on how you want to work. I'm also going to include the 3D kind of version of tags that these 2D tags always face the camera. 3D tags have a space in there. So if I've got 3D tags, it's going to actually take up space and be text objects that I could bake if I wanted to. So the 2D tags are the same as like annotation dots, and the 3D tags are actually text objects that I could bake, and maybe I want to plot a plan view of my space frame and want to know where all those little points are or something like that. It's a really easy thing to do. The text here, and I'll just change the size to be something a little bit more reasonable. Something like that. So you're not going to have to worry about any of the guts of this. This will be a cluster. The two things that you kind of just worry about is, do I want the 3D tags or the 2D tags? And that can be managed just by turning the previews for one of them off. So if I don't want to see I just click it there. And it'll have the numbers for that. If I want something outside of that, maybe I'm not on my computer, you can export this to a CSV sheet So I right click this and say stream contents. I turn that on. I'm right clicking the panel itself, and then when I say stream destination, all I do is type a name for a file. So I say this is test2, and I say I'm going to save type as, and I go to CSV type, and I hit OK, and I save it. And I look at my desktop, my sloppy desktop there. It's in there somewhere. Got one here. It just outputs it to the things, and that'll continue to update. So as long as this, once you close this file, it'll stream those contents and keep them updated. So once it's all ready, you can just go to that file and it's good to go. Hopefully that'll get you the kind of coordinates that you need. In terms of what you do with the site itself, like what kind of swatch, that's actually, obviously it's going to be a product of like what you've got going on your model. We think it's a good idea to include the track because it's a nice frame of reference in your site model. So a kind of quick way to do that would be to take the objects that I've got here. So I'm looking at my space frame and to do a bounding box around it. So I say bounding box and I hit enter to accept solids. Since it's three-dimensional, it wants to create an actual box by default, like that. That's the kind of bare minimum. So when I'm looking at what I would want to include, I'm going to hold down the shift button and grab one of these boxes on the gumball to scale it. And I'm going to scale it to include a little bit more of the track in the plan view so that I can see a little bit more context like that. When I look at my dimensions on the model on this is about 22 inches right now. When I first did it, I've expanded it by a few inches. So you're talking about a 2-foot model, a couple inches bigger than the foot of your base. So not terribly big. Now I've got something in space that's in the right spot, right? So I can slice this thing up and make a model on it. I would make it a little bit bigger to make sure that it slices all the way through my topo and get all the information I need. And in order to do that, I can just take the gumball, it's got a little blue handle here, and just make it taller. So I'm just scaling it in the Z to make it taller. So this, right now, I can hide this for a second and look at my bounding box. It's slicing through my model, at least the part that I care about, right? And I can always bring it down a little bit. And this is one big group that's locked right here. So I can do a couple different things with this one. One, it's a big item, so I wouldn't necessarily copy the whole thing, but I can split it without deleting the input, and I'll do a Boolean split. So I'll go to my solids and say Boolean split. The thing I'm splitting is going to be my topography. Make sure you get all of it. So I'm going to right click here and say select objects. I'm going to make sure it says delete input equals no. And then when it says cutting surfaces, I'm going to use this as my cutting surfaces and hit enter. It's going to split it up. Shouldn't have any problem splitting it. It's got to go slice through a couple of layers, but it might have to double the tolerance for it to work. It should be fine. That just means that one of the things was sitting up against another edge and it doesn't know whether to include it or not. But this just means that it worked and it had to include a tolerance. This is a pretty high tolerance model. You can see it's hanging out in there, but the thing itself, the original thing, was in a group. There was a group of all these things. So the output is sitting in that group. So what you want to do is just ungroup your stuff. And you should be able to use the select last. Nah, you can't use it because everything got included on it. So I'm just going to do a bounding box from like a side view here, like that. And something that's out in my bounding box, like that, is going to come out of it. It looks like I have all my vertical layers just by checking. So this is the product of that. Oops. Do it again. Might be easier to do it from the top. I'm holding down Alt to force the selection box. Weird. Go from this side, see what's happening. Oh, it's still in the group. Thank you. These groups are forceful, man. They never want to give up. Again, if you don't like working all in the same place there, right, you can just get, so this keeps other stuff, it keeps all that split stuff as well. Not going to hurt anything, it's a little bit of extra geometry. If you're not happy with it, you can just duplicate this whole layer and run that on there and then delete everything else. But here you've got a nice piece of the site as well that you can build, use as a reference for a topo model. These are 3/8, right? Because they're 2-foot breaks at 3/16. So these little slivers are talking about 3/8. So you can slice it directly like that, or double up layers, or make it however you want. I think we said chipboard or cardboard, standard site model stuff. You know, you don't want to spend a lot of material money on it. Just something to have a nice base for your static model. And the static model being probably the same material you use for Model 1